Last lecture, I looked at moral relativism. Moral relativism is a theory that denies objectivity and universality with regard to moral claims or prescriptive claims. Divine command theory purports to be an objectivist or a moral realist position. It says that objective moral truths, and again by moral truth here I mean prescriptive, the truth of a prescriptive claim, is based on divine commands. And so that's our basic idea here. The metaethical theory that ethically significant statements, which is to say prescriptive statements, are made true or false only by divine decree, right? In other words, by the commandments of some divine being, a personal God that's concerned with morality in some way. So here, the obvious example is to think about an omnicompetent God being the basis of morality. So that notion of an omnicompetent God we looked at in chapter 3. Right. And so here's some potential strengths then of this position. First is it claims to resolve our debate between the realist or the moral objectivist and the moral relativist in favor of objectivism. Right. It provides an authority to appeal to to resolve moral disagreements. We have a particular religious scripture or a religious authority to work through that issue and is the basis for resolving those disagreements. The idea of divine command theory seems to help us make sense of the notion of a moral law because it posits a lawgiver. And then it also helps make sense of the close cultural connection between and social connection between morality on the one hand and religion on the other. They seem to go a lot hand in hand with a lot of hand in hand between the two there. So several apparent strengths of this theory. Now, picking up on that last point, the close cultural and social connection between morality and sociology, we might think of an initial argument here that could be given for divine command theory, namely something like, so this study that I have a panel up here, the slide shows that there's a lot of distrust over non-religious people in American cultures. And then if you look at the two studies mentioned at the bottom, there were two more recent studies that not only showed that that was true in America, but also across cultures, that there's a lot of suspicion, moral suspicion of those that do not have any religion. And so you might think of the following kind of argument being given on the basis of those sorts of considerations. So if most people believe that morality necessarily depends on religion in some way, notice the strength of that claim, necessarily depends on religion in some way. So most people believe that. That's a true claim. Religion is thought to be necessary either for objective moral truths, there's our metaethical perspective, for genuine moral guidance, that's the normative issue, or for moral motivation, another metaethical issue, the problem of why be moral? Well, why be moral? Because there is a God who will eventually evaluate us in terms of morality. So the idea here is that all of those people couldn't be mistaken, right? So it's easy to think of the following kind of argument. If most people believe that morality necessarily depends on religion, then divine command theory is true. Most people believe that morality is necessary for, that religion is necessary for morality, thus divine command theory is true, right? But of course there's an obvious problem. If that's the argument for divine command theory, that looks like a textbook example of the appeal to people fallacy. So that argument's not going to work very well to support divine command theory, but we do have, or at least your book mentions, there are many arguments that could be given here, but your book mentions two others, ones that are not obviously fallacious though. So we'll come back to those here in just a second. If you want to think about a pop culture example of divine command theory, we got two basic examples in the text. The first one is Crimes and Misdemeanors, where we have a rabbi in the film who expresses divine command theory explicitly. Judah here, the gentleman with the white hair next to Woody Allen in the picture on the screen here, worries about that, but he's not a religious person and seems to do some things in the film that suggest that he doesn't really believe much in morality. Woody Allen's character expresses more of an existentialist view of morality. And then the other film that your book uses here to illustrate both divine command theory as well as a problem with divine command theory is the movie Frailty. All right, so we got, I'll come back to that issue of frailty here in just a second when we get to the objections. First, we got two arguments here. I'm going to call these two arguments, and these are on page page 180 in the textbook if you want to follow along there. First, we're going to have what I'm going to call the natural order and the moral order argument for divine command theory, and then the other one I'm going to call the lawgiver argument. And I've got two conversational versions of these arguments again here. So here's the first one, the natural order and the moral order argument for divine command theory. So the physical or natural world exists as it does because it was created and ordered by God to operate according to natural laws. God plays a causal role in the existence of the natural world by creating natural laws that govern the physical world and its operations. Right? Those laws render events understandable and predictable. Just as there is then a natural world with a natural order that operates according to natural laws, there's also a moral order, right? A moral world that operates also according to moral laws. So then the idea here is that based on this comparison between the natural order and it was ordered by God, right? And we also have a moral order. So the idea here is then just as there was God played a causal role in ordering the natural world, God plays a causal role in ordering the moral world as well, right? And so that gives us the conclusion that just as God ordered the natural world with natural laws, he ordered the moral world with moral laws, and that's affirming then the conclusion of divine command theory. So again, make sure you get some practice formulating these arguments in proper form or stacked form. And again, what I mean by that is laying out the premises in the order in which they lead to the conclusion, and numbering your premises, right? In the case of this argument, it's probably best to use an inductive type of argument. So this lends, because we're comparing two things here, it lends itself to argument by analogy. So take a few minutes and reconstruct the argument out of this passage or the passage in the textbook as an argument by analogy for divine command theory. And then after you do that, come back and let's go on to the second argument. Okay, so here's our second argument for divine command theory. Let's call this one the lawgiver argument. And again, I'm drawing this example out of page 280 in the textbook. Excuse me, 180 in the textbook. I believe it's 180 in the textbook. So here's the conversational form of the argument again, or presentation of the argument. The notion of a moral law, a law that indicates or prescribes what we ought to do, makes no sense without the notion of a lawgiver who is the recognized authority to both issue commandments and punish those who do not abide by them. In other words, to enforce them. In the case of civil laws, there are civil authorities that pass laws and authorize the public, that authorize the police to force the police force to ticket or arrest people who violate those laws. If there is an objective moral law, then there must be a lawgiver. Only a being that is omnicompetent would be qualified authority to issue moral laws or commands and to hold people accountable to them. So since there is a moral law that exists, there must be a lawgiver, and that lawgiver is an omnicompetent God. So again, a conclusion that supports this notion that morality necessarily depends on divine decree. So just like we've been doing, again, using either this passage or how the argument is presented on page 180, reformulate this as a deductive argument. The last one, I kind of looks like it lends itself more to argument by analogy, but this one looks like it's going to lend itself more to a deductive form. So you could take that sentence there. If there's an objective moral law, then there must be a lawgiver, and using that conditional, complete the rest of the argument. All right, so after you've got to your argument reconstructions and down, you can move on to the objections. Again, I'm happy to look at your reconstructions and give you feedback on them before you have to do the short answer assignments for a grade, which part of those assignments, of course, requires you to present the arguments for that particular assignment. All right, let's look at criticisms of divine command theory. First, again, some criticisms of specific arguments for divine command theory, and then at the end, a general objection to divine command theory. All right, so the first one's up here. So a criticism of the natural order, moral order argument. That depends on a comparison between natural laws and moral laws. We might worry about whether there's a significant disanalogy there. And secondly, we might worry about whether there's an equivocation fallacy over law there, since moral laws don't seem to be analogous to natural laws. It's very difficult to disobey a natural law. Right? And so one thing you might worry about here, especially philosophy majors and minors, here natural law does not mean a moral theory. It means a theory about the way the natural world operates, not about, it's not talking about natural law in the sense of natural law ethical theory, which is the idea that we can arrive at prescriptive truths based on what we observe about the natural world. And then we have a criticism of the lawgiver argument. It's certainly worth wondering whether the idea that a law doesn't make sense without a lawgiver. Perhaps it's the case that natural laws, for example, are brute facts about the way the world operates. And so the idea of a law without a lawgiver may not be as incoherent as that argument supposes. So you got those two particular worries about specific arguments for divine command theory. And then these last criticisms, they don't really attack a particular argument for divine command theory, but they do attack the idea of divine command theory. And whereas some criticisms of arguments rely on premises other than the ones, or ideas other than the ones that are in an argument or a position, these last two criticisms take the idea of divine command theory and then challenge it on the basis of its own ideas, right? So more of an internal criticism there. So the Euthyphro dilemma doesn't challenge God's existence. It assumes, for the sake of argument, that morality is based on religion, and then tries to show that if we accept that claim, we end up with an unacceptable implication of that claim. And the same is true of the demonic voices objection here. So first, the Euthyphro dilemma. This is an old objection to classical divine command theory that was first leveled by Plato in his, or Socrates in the Euthyphro dialogue. And so in the dialogue, there's this young man that's on his way to charge his own father with impiety. He comes across Socrates, who's been charged with impiety. And so Socrates says, well, if you're going to charge your own dad with impiety, you must really know what it is and what you're talking about. And so he starts asking, well, what does it mean to be pious? What does it mean to live according to divine decrees? And this younger Athenian male starts trying to propose different definitions of that to Socrates, and he defeats each one of them. And he finally says, look, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, right? Or is it pious because the gods love it? So in other words, is the thing that you're claiming is good, do the gods love it because it's good, or is it good because the gods love it, right? So you could kind of take that as the basis of an either or for an argument. So either God commanding X is what makes it right or wrong. So it's in the commanding that is the right-making property of that. Or God is commanding us to do certain things because those things are intrinsically right or wrong. So if they're wrong, then it would be an intrinsically wrong thing to perform that action, right? But based on the intrinsic merits of the intrinsic rightness or wrongness of those actions. So if we take the first route and we say that, well, it's the commanding from God that makes that action right or wrong, then morality seems to be based on God's arbitrary whims, because God could get up one day and say, love your neighbor, the next day kill all the firstborn males. So it looks like that's an unacceptable implication of claiming it's the act of commanding that actually makes the thing right or wrong. Because God doesn't seem to be required to command one thing over another. So you get kind of a charge of, instead of it being a matter of mere human subjective opinion, here it's just a matter of divine subjective opinion. It's arbitrary rather than principled. If you take the other route and say, well, look, to avoid this arbitrariness problem, God wouldn't arbitrarily tell us to do one thing or another, or base morality on arbitrary whims. God bases his commands on what sorts of things are intrinsically right or intrinsically wrong. Well, if we go that route, then we've admitted that there's a standard of right and wrong independent of God's will, which is the exact opposite of divine command theory. So either way you go, it looks like you land in a problem for divine command theory. Either it implies morality is arbitrary, that looks unacceptable, or it implies divine command theory is self-defeating, also a logically unacceptable implication of an argument. Right, so that's the Euthyphro dilemma there. And notice again that the Euthyphro dilemma doesn't do anything like challenge God's existence. It takes for granted that God could exist and that morality is necessarily based on God's existence, and then shows, if you grant the truth of that claim, that you end up with some problematic implications that are supposed to then show that the argument must be unacceptable in some way, or the position is unacceptable. And then we have the demonic voices objection. Here again, this argument doesn't go after what you might think is the initial place to go after a divine command theory, namely trying to show that, well, it's hard to prove that God exists, right? We saw some of that back in chapter 3, but neither of these last two objections challenge the existence of God. They take for granted the basic divine command theory position and then show how it leads to unacceptable or problematic implications for that theory. So with regard to this objection, what your book calls the demonic voices objection, there seems to be an epistemic problem with divine command theory. How do I know whether I'm receiving legitimate commands from God or if a demonic voice is tricking me? So we end up with a bit of a problem there. In the movie Frailty, kind of does a good job of illustrating this potential problem. So in the movie, the main character here, played by Bill Paxton, he's a single father, and he believes that he's received a message from an angel that he needs to go kill demons. And so he convinces his boys that he heard this voice and that it's true, and that he's going to receive some signs from God or from an angel about who needs to be killed. They're going to provide him with a special weapon, right, and some gloves that protect him from being seen doing these sorts of things. And so one of the boys, trusting his dad, goes along with this. He's young and impressionable. And the other boy that's a little bit older thinks dad is mentally ill. He hasn't really heard the voice of an angel or the voice of God telling him to do these sorts of things. He's mentally ill. So how do I know whether the commands that seem to be commands to me are legitimate commands, or the result of a demon tricking me, or of mental illness, right? So how do we tell the difference between legitimate and illegitimate commands then? And then another dimension to the problem in Frailty is that he believes that he's received commandments to do things that are contrary to common sense morality. The demons that he's been charged with killing look like just innocent, ordinary people, right? So we have the problem there of what happens if one of these commands tells me to do something contrary to common sense morality. Well, if morality depends solely on God's commands, then it's the right thing to do is to violate common sense morality. All right, so that's a little bit on divine command theory and some objections to it. Again, make sure you go over and formulate the arguments, and then start thinking about whether the different criticisms of those arguments amount to errors of fact, fallacy, self-contradiction, or maybe some other type of error that doesn't easily fit into those first three categories. All right, so we'll take a break for now. Y'all can make sure and review what you've covered up to this point in the semester, in this chapter, and then come back a little bit later for the last lecture on this chapter, the lecture on ethical objectivism versus ethical non-objectivism. All right, folks, hope you all are well.